Hey guys, today we're going to talk about objectivity as volitional adherence to reality by means of logic from Chapter 4, Objectivity in Leonard Peikoff's book Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Stay tuned. All right, so let's sum up what Leonard covers in this chapter. So we start out with the fact that human beings on the conceptual level are fallible, that we need a method in order to guide our knowledge, a method that is based on facts so that we adhere to the primacy of existence, and a method consistent with man's means of knowing so that we abide by the principle that consciousness has identity. And that leads ultimately to the idea of objectivity, where Leonard defines that to be objective in our mental processes means to follow certain rules of method, a method based on facts and appropriate to man's means of cognition. This is logic, and we get a discussion of logic, and we get a discussion of what's distinctive about the objectivist view of logic. And that's going to kick off or really set the stage for an in-depth discussion of those distinctive features, particularly the way in which objectivism really takes seriously the idea that knowledge is contextual and that knowledge is hierarchical. So in this video, I want to do two things. The first is to clarify some of the key concepts that we cover here, namely objectivity, logic, and knowledge. And then I want to go on and look at what are some of the basic steps that a thinker, and specifically Aristotle, would have to have gone through in order to induce or discover objectivity that Ayn Rand will later build on in her own case. So the first point I want to make about objectivity is the way in which it's self-conscious adherence to reality. So you can contrast objectivity with rationality. Rationality in the objectivist view is a virtue. It's the virtue of being reality-oriented, of going by facts rather than your feelings. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the virtue of rationality later. But rationality is something that's open to everyone. That is, 10,000 years ago, you can know, okay, I'm trying to understand the world versus just going by what I feel like going, or at least at a certain level of sophistication. But objectivity is different. Objectivity is once you have some conception of an explicit method, I'm going to use that method. I'm going to adhere to that method. So people can be logical. They can make arguments that are logically valid long before you get the explicit concept of logic. And in fact, as we're going to see, Aristotle needed this to be true, needed to have many examples of people giving logical and illogical arguments and being able to distinguish in a certain way between them before they ever got the concept of logic as an explicit method. And so objectivity we're dealing with, once you have knowledge of a method, it is what we're stressing with objectivity is your control over using that method to guide your thinking and to ultimately guide your action versus dropping it. And possibly a good analogy for this is if you think about like a game like poker. You can sit down at a game of poker and, once you understand the basic rules of the game, you can try your best. You can say, all right, I'm really going to try to think about what my opponent has and how to beat him. But you don't know what you're doing, and you're not going to be that good at it. You won't have that much control over how well you do, but certainly you have the ability to try your best versus I'm just going to, throw out the cards and make bets at random. I'm going to be swept away by, my emotion when somebody beats me. I'm going to get angry and just start betting in really obviously stupid ways. You have a certain amount of control, but now contrast that with a pro. What a pro does is that they have a certain method, and the method doesn't guarantee that they'll win. But for example, they can think about, well, what are the odds that I have the winning hand? And what are the odds that I could get the winning hand if I keep betting into this game? And will the amount of money, the so-called pot odds, are they going to be great enough to justify taking these risks? And so they have an explicit method. And a method doesn't guarantee success, but it gives them the best chance at success, and it gives them the best control over their actions and over the game. And so one of the things I'm stressing here is the way in which objectivity is a norm. A norm is a rule. It's a piece of guidance that said you should do this. And it says, and in that sense, it's different from something like knowledge or truth. So knowledge and truth are outcomes of a certain cognitive process. And it really has two aspects. It's, from the objectivist view, it's you've grasped a fact, and both aspects are important. There is a fact. You're naming something that is true in reality out there apart from your mind, but it's that you've grasped it, you've understood it. Objectivity primarily refers to a process. It refers to something that's fully under your control, and then products from that process. So you can have, for example, an objective concept, or let's say an objective conclusion, one that you've reached following the right method, and then say, uh-oh, I got it wrong. I didn't know certain facts that were unavailable to me at the time. And we'll explore the precise meaning of how you can be objective and wrong later. But I just want to have it distinguished from you can't be true and state something that's false. You can think that you're stating a truth, but that truth, knowledge, these are about, okay, not only did you go through the right process, but you reached the right outcome. Objectivity is focused on the process. And another way of stressing that is saying it's what's under your full conscious control. This is the idea that it's a norm. Once you know the method, you have the power at every given point to be objective, to exercise your free will, to say, all right, I'm going to use the best methods I have access to in order to try to grasp what is. So let's take a different kind of analogy here. You couldn't have a norm that said you should make $1 million, right? That's not something you have full control over. You could certainly choose to be productive, choose to go into a field that has enormous upside, choose to take the risks and follow the principles that make success as possible, as likely as possible. But the actual outcome is outside your control, and a norm has to be something you can choose to do. And what makes it a norm is that this is the means that gives you the best chance of reaching those desired outcomes, whether it's knowledge, truth, or values. So objectivity is a norm. It's saying you should choose in any cognitive process to follow the method of logic in order to grasp reality, in order to stay connected to facts. And one objection that I've heard to the way objectivists talk about objectivity is that, well, you're redefining the term. And so I think it's worth going through sort of two common sense ways, or ways that objectivity is discussed in kind of the culture, and connect it to Ayn Rand. So one is, objective is usually used in contrast to subjective, and in contrast to the subject. And you're talking about a mind-independent object. And in that sense, objectivism retains that usage when Ayn Rand will often talk about objective reality. And basically what that is just a usage that's asserting the primacy of existence and saying that, there are objects out there that are what they are, independent of us, what we know about them, what we wish about them, what we think about them. But what objectivism says is that's not the primary use of the term. That's not why we need the term. And what we need the term for is for method. So what's the other way that people will use it? Well, it's to be objective is, sometimes it will be put as impersonal, but you're not clouded by your biases, your feelings, your judgments. And so in that sense, Ayn Rand's not redefining objectivity, she's clarifying objectivity. She's saying, yes, that's what it means to be objective, but how do we do that? How we do that is we need an actual method. Now, some people just say, well, you can't do it because we have feelings and biases. And Ayn Rand's view is that, no, we can do it. We just need a method. It's a method that is going to keep us connected to facts. Well, what kind of method can keep us connected to facts? Well, it's one that's appropriate to us, to our way of looking at facts. And so this goes back to what we talked about last time, where objectivity reflects both consciousness and existence. It reflects the the factual side and the nature of our means of cognition. Now, going through this issue helped me figure out a question that I was wrestling with at the beginning, which is, well, look, if all objectivity is saying is, well, go by logic, you need a method, go by logic, do we even really need the concept objectivity? Why can't we just have the concept logical? And if you reflect on the fact that objectivity is self-conscious commitment to method that leads to knowledge, and that what it's focused on is that you know what you're doing while you're thinking, that needs to be distinguished from abiding by the method unself-consciously. So again, it goes back to this idea of, people were logical long before Aristotle. People were also illogical, right? And what happened once you reach the realm of saying, we've defined a science of logic, is that you can either do that self-consciously and thus your mental processes are objective, or you can fail to do it, in which case they're non-objective. So it's bringing in this element of self-awareness of a method and of self-consciously abiding by the method, which is why you need this concept, that you couldn't replace it with logic, because that would wipe out or fail to emphasize what's distinctive about objectivity, which distinctive is that it's volitional adherence to reality by logic. It's the volitional choice to use logic so that you can remain connected to facts. So a little bit of a discussion of logic. In the conventional view, I think logic is typically equated with syllogistic reasoning, right? A is B, all B is C, therefore A is C. And the idea is you can plug anything into that and you have valid reasoning. And objectivism actually agrees with that when we're talking about validity, it is about the form of the argument, not about the content. But objectivism's point is that logic is about more than that. So the way Ayn Rand defines it is logic is the art of non-contradictory identification. And there's two, I think, really novel points here. So the non-contradictory part of the view is that you're not just avoiding a contradiction in a single syllogism, it's that you're integrating it into the sum of your knowledge so that there's no contradictions anywhere, that your knowledge is an integrated whole, and that to say that you validated your knowledge is to say not I avoided one particular contradiction here, but that I can make it part of that whole without any contradictions. Then the second point is, if we said it's the art of non-contradictory identification, it's the art of non-contradictory identification, so that the content that's going to be plugged into valid forms needs to come ultimately from sense perception, that you need to be able to connect your premises that are going to make up your conclusion. They need to come from reality. And so we're going to talk about, well, how do we actually implement both these points? How do we actually integrate something with the sum of our knowledge? How do we check that our premises have come from reality and therefore the conclusion actually follows? But that I think both of these points are helpful in understanding objectivism is a much richer concept of logic, though it's not dispensing with the earlier views. It's building on them. It's really getting at what you could ask, for instance, well, why is it valuable to know the syllogism? Well, because that's a way of implementing this wider attempt at non-contradictory identification. And so objectivism is just, I think, taking logic further and making it ultimately more useful, because instead of kind of being, I think a lot of people will learn logic in college. Certainly if you are interested in philosophy, or there's, numerous other fields. But in terms of your day-to-day life, it's very rare that you're sitting around like deducing the mortality of Patricia, right? But if you understand the wider way of thinking about logic as non-contradictory identification, it's an ongoing part of your life, and you can see how useful it is and really make it part of your thinking. So finally, a quick word on how objectivism thinks of knowledge. And that is, as it'll be put, it's a grasp of fact. It's a knowledge for objectivism is a form of awareness. And So you could distinguish knowledge from sort of like just a momentary perception. Like I saw a bird flying, we wouldn't put that as knowledge. There's something enduring about knowledge. It's a kind of ongoing form of awareness of reality. And one way that knowledge is often talked about in philosophy is that knowledge or truth, these are, and certainly truth, these are kind of properties of propositions. So a proposition is a conceptual statement, all S is P, all men are mortal. And it's sort of like truth is the truth in that proposition or not? And we have to figure out what's going on in that proposition. And Objectivism's view is that's the wrong way to think about it, that truth, knowledge, these aren't in propositions. Propositions are our way of holding truth. They're our way of putting into words and maintaining as a perspective on the world a grasp of an actual fact. And so, it's not about we're trying to we don't just, throw out, all right, here's a proposition and out here's reality, and then we're trying to figure out how the two connected. It's that we're going to undergo a process of cognition. And when we grasp a fact, when we see that something is true, then we say, okay, now we have a proposition that's true. But I suspect this could be confusing, but what I want to, I think we'll see later how this comes up, particularly when we talk about issues like certainty. But it's just really important to get that from Objectivism's perspective, truth is a mind in contact with reality. It's not a free-floating proposition that God would say, yeah, that corresponds, regardless of whether any human beings actually grasp that correspondence. So now I want to turn to the discovery of the concept of objectivity, or how to induce the concept of objectivity. So several times in these videos, I've mentioned Leonard Peikoff's course, Objectivism Through Induction. And I highly recommend it. I think it's one of the most important things anyone has ever put on tape. And part of what the whole thing is about is that in order to really understand something, you have to be able to get it from reality. Even if you learn it from somebody else, you have to retrace the steps by which they would have grasped it from reality. And how do you actually do that? And OPAR is going to give us kind of at a super high level, at a super essentialized level, what that process consists of. Namely, we're going to talk about integration and reduction. But in the course, you actually get case study after case study of how to do that for some of the key ideas in Objectivism. So I want to go through, or at least suggest, some of what Leonard covers about objectivity, because that's one of the ideas he induces in the course. And I want to do this for two reasons. So one is that it'll clarify our understanding of objectivity. And number two, it is a concrete example of what we're going to be going into when we talk about reduction and, to a lesser degree, integration in the rest of this chapter. So I wanted us to have at the ready, this is what it means to bring something back to reality and really understand it, to actually be objective. And so what better example of how to be objective than inducing objectivity? Now, I want to say I'm not going through everything Leonard covers by any means. I think he spends something like 4 hours on the whole thing with objectivity. Induction is a long process, and even giving you kind of the skeletons of an induction is a long process. And now Leonard breaks up the induction into two basic parts. One is Aristotle's concept of objectivity, which we'll talk about in a second. And then he talks about Ayn Rand's further clarifications of objectivity, and I'm just going to give you a hint of Aristotle, and it's just a hint. Again, I want to underline, what I'm hoping you'll take away is, I should go listen to this course, which is available on YouTube and on the Ayn Rand Institute app. I forget what it's called at the moment, but the ARI app has the whole course available for free. So let's dive in. So Leonard starts with Aristotle's concept of objectivity, which he puts as volitional adherence to reality by the use of logic. So you can see the contrast, whereas Ayn Rand has both the contribution of facts and the contribution of the mind between, existence and man's consciousness. For Aristotle, it's no, we're using our minds to follow a method that keeps us connected to facts, and that's kind of the foundation of Rand's view of objectivity, and that's what humanity has had up until she kind of expanded on it or clarified it in her work. So if we're trying to think about what would it take to reach that view of objectivity, volitional adherence, reality by means of logic, well, the first thing you need is that the whole need for a method for thinking. And Leonard points out, if your view is, well, you would just say, like, we're fallible, so therefore we need a method to make sure that we can stay connected to reality. He stresses you could not get to the need for a method just from the fact that we're fallible. That historically what actually you see is that fallibility leads most people to become intrinsicists. We'll talk more about intrinsicism later, but it's they look for revelations, or they look for authorities who receive revelations who are going to tell them what to do. That it is a sophisticated discovery to get to the idea of we need a method, let alone what that method should be. And in fact, as we'll see when we go through what's involved in Aristotle reaching objectivity, there's really two major pieces of it. First is just getting that you need a method, and only then it's getting the specific method of logic. So how would we even get the need for a method? And Leonard, his reduction basically has 4 steps. So one is that you'd have to get that there's a part of our mind that is fallible, that can depart from reality. And then there's a part that's infallible, that's automatically connected to reality. You'd have to get that you have control over the part that's fallible, and that it's the automatic part which is connected to reality. Then you'd need to get the relationship between these parts. How do they in effect talk to each other such that you could check the fallible against the infallible? And that brings us back ultimately to the starting point, the first things that are directly observable, which is the distinction between, as you probably had guessed, concepts and percepts, between the conceptual and the perceptual. And that, that Aristotle had from Plato, that Plato is drawing attention to, there's ideas and what we perceive, through the senses. And in fact, Plato, we've talked about the way in which Plato went into great detail about how vastly different they are, about, ideas were abstract versus physical, they were mental rather than physical, they were single rather than many. Like there was, he had a whole litany of things, known by the senses versus known by reason. And so you need this distinction, and only then can you start climbing up those inductive steps that we talked about. So you'd start with, all right, there's these concepts versus percepts, and you'd have to get then that, well, it's the conceptual part that's fallible, it's the perceptual level that's infallible. I have control over the conceptual part. I don't have control. The perceptual and fallible part is automatic. And then I can check, this is the real key, I can check the conceptual fallible part against perception. I can tie them, I can make sure that the conceptual is right by connecting it in some way to the perceptual. I don't know how to do that yet, but now we've reached the point of, I need a method. You can see after you've gone through those stages, a method is both necessary because we have to correct our errors at the conceptual level, and it's possible because we can check the conceptual against the perceptual. So again, that's just the first part right there. That's just, we need a method. We haven't gotten to logic yet. Now, that's not the induction. That is just identifying the steps that would go into the induction. Induction, remember, is going to be looking out at reality. Now we've just broken down a sophisticated principle into the steps of kind of principles that you would have to, or generalizations you would have to reach in order to reach it. But it's at each stage you would have to actually be undergoing observation. Leonard talks about this. I'll just give one sort of example. It's how would he get that concepts are built on percepts? Because remember, Plato got that there's a distinction between concepts and percepts, but he did not see them as related. He did not see concepts as built on percepts. That's Aristotle's achievement. So how would he have gotten it from reality? Well, it would have been by reflecting on, this is what my mind is doing when I'm forming concepts, that what I'm doing is abstracting. I'm separating in thought what can't be separated in reality. I'm selectively focusing on similarities and setting aside the differences. Now, again, remember, Ayn Rand has a much fuller and different view of abstraction, but that alone is enough to get that there's a connection, that abstractions are not part of some kind of separate universe cut off from the world that we know through intuition or revelation, that they are formed by looking at concretes and having an abstract perspective of, okay, these are the similarities and I can mentally set aside the differences. And so that's going to enable him then to induce this idea of, all right, concepts are built on percepts. It's by going through and observing himself forming concepts that is going to be the inductive material for that. So for each of those stages, you would need to think, all right, well, what is the inductive material, the observations and reality that are leading to each of those steps? So how would Aristotle get logic as the method and tracing back, reducing that conclusion? Leonard starts out with, well, what he'd ultimately have to get is that to validate an idea is to trace it back step by step, have valid premises all the way back to axioms, all the way back to sense perception. And that to get that, you'd have to have the idea of validity, the idea of that this is what makes any given argument, any given relationship valid. Well, how are you going to get that? You'd have to observe before that you'd have to look at a whole bunch of arguments and separate them out to valid and invalid ones, and then you'd get the universal principle of validity, which would be non-contradiction. And how would you get that? What would be the starting point? Well, the starting point would be to get that people argue, that there were people engaging in premises leading to a conclusion, and that would be the starting point. So if we've gone kind of down the structure, and so going up the structure, right, Aristotle would have to observe, all right, there's arguments, there's premises leading to conclusions. He'd have to get, well, some of these are valid and some of these aren't. And then he'd get that, okay, there's kind of a universal rule of validity that is going to be non-contradiction, that's going to unite all the cases of valid reasoning and invalid reasoning. And then that to fully validate an argument, you'd have to validate, the premises going all the way back to that which is the given, that which is self-evident, that which can't depart from reality, to perception. And so that's going to be the kind of induction Leonard goes through. And again, we're not going to go through the actual induction of each of these points. We're not going through the whole process. But I do want to comment on one aspect of it that I found really revelatory. And that's the idea of validity as a matter of the form rather than the content of the argument. Aristotle grasping that there's, forms of reasoning that are valid irrespective of content, and then forms that are invalid. And here Leonard made two really striking points, reasons that he thought Aristotle was kind of in a position to grasp that. Because, it's like, how would you figure that out if you really took seriously that you hadn't learned it from somebody else, you hadn't learned it from Aristotle? That kind of perspective to get that there's an abstract form of arguing that is valid, and that it's not tied to any particular content. Well, Leonard thinks there's two things. So one is mathematics, and the second is something about Aristotle's philosophy. There's always form and matter in all of these different areas, that there's kind of the structure, and then the specific content permeates throughout his philosophy. But the idea of like mathematics, that he would have had to see that there's a kind of form of logical argument, there's a structure to the reasoning, would then lead a genius to think, well, maybe this is true of all reasoning and not just mathematical reasoning. So in any case, I found all of those very helpful, but I think you can see the kind of enormous complexity that goes into discovering objectivity, and that I find that super clarifying compared to just taking as, all right, well, we're fallible, so we need a method. Oh, okay. Well, no, like, how do you get there, and how would you ever get the method? I think sheds a lot of light on the method. It sheds a lot of light on, I think once we turn to implementing the objectivist way of thinking about the method of logic, if you've gone through the Objectivism through Induction course, there'll be a lot more richness to it. So again, I hope this motivates you to listen to Leonard's lecture. I hope you've gotten a little bit deeper of an appreciation for objectivity. But one reason I wanted to do this is that when you read OPAR, you read Ayn Rand's writing, it can often seem that, okay, well, it's very deductive. It's A leads to B leads to C, and so there's a temptation to think, well, this is what it means to think philosophically, and this is kind of how you would discover philosophic knowledge. And it's really important to get that there's a difference between presenting and systematizing knowledge and discovering it for the first time, getting it from reality. That to get it from reality, you could never present ideas that way. You couldn't even hold them in mind because it's messy, as we've seen. It's complex. That when it gets to systematizing, you're going to have this kind of deductive flavor to it. And when you're communicating, you have to communicate it in that way. But for you, as somebody taking it in and trying to learn it, getting the kind of logical connections as a system, which is what's presented in OPAR, is hugely valuable. But then for you to really understand it and to be able to take it in, you have to be able to go through and retrace the steps by which somebody would discover it. And so you need both perspectives. You need the kind of depth and connection to reality and observation that you get through what Leonard covers in Objectivism through Induction. And then you need that essentialized, systematized, integrated, very logically connected perspective that you get in order to hold that material in mind. And so I think, as we continue in the book, sometimes we'll want to take the more, how do we get this from reality perspective? I don't think we're going to go through a whole induction or even what we've gone through here, but we'll want to kind of take the more messy, exploratory, break it down to reality perspective, but then not lose the essentialized interconnectedness of the whole. And because both of those are necessary. But what I want to warn against is the idea of being able to leap from how a thinker like Ayn Rand presents their view to what kind of the way in which one would get that view from reality, because they're not the same. That's it for this video. Next time we will be discussing I think knowledge is contextual. In the meantime, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. As always, the best way to stay in touch is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.